Television studios in the early 1970s ran on a particular kind of controlled chaos, and this one was no different. 3 hours before air, the soundstage was still half a construction site. Grips wheeling flats into position, a lighting director standing on a ladder arguing gently with his gaffer about a hot spot on camera 2. A production assistant taping cable runs to the floor in long strips of silver gaffer tape. By the time the doors opened for the studio audience, the set had transformed into something warmer. A small living room arrangement built for television. 2 low armchairs angled toward each other across a round coffee table. A backdrop painted to suggest bookshelves, and a window that led nowhere. The lights above were already hot, throwing that particular flat, shadowless glow that makes every face on a 1970s broadcast look slightly larger than life. Bruce arrived at the studio a little over an hour before the taping, dressed simply. Dark trousers, a fitted button shirt, no jacket, nothing that suggested performance. He'd agreed to this appearance on one condition, made clear to the producers weeks earlier: no demonstrations, no breaking boards on live television, no pad work, no prove it right now stunts dressed up as spontaneous television magic. He was there to talk. He'd spent most of his career being flattened into kicks and punches by people who found it easier to market the fists than the mind behind them. And for one evening, he wanted the conversation to be the whole show. The producers had agreed, mostly because Bruce Lee agreeing to sit for an interview at all was considered a coup regardless of the terms. Backstage, in the narrow hallway that served as a green room, Bruce ran through his own version of preparation. Not physical, but mental. He sat quietly for several minutes before a stagehand knocked to walk him to the set. Eyes closed, breathing slow and even, doing the same kind of centering he did before difficult training sessions. A young production assistant, nervous and eager, asked if he wanted water, coffee, anything. He asked only for a few minutes of quiet, and got them. The studio audience filed in around the same time. Several dozen people who had queued outside for tickets, some there specifically for Bruce, most there simply because the show was popular and tickets were free. They settled into the tiered risers with the particular restless energy of a live audience. The shuffling for seats, the low hum of conversation, someone's laugh carrying a beat too long, the warm-up comedian working the crowd before the taping proper began, telling jokes to loosen everyone up, reminding them when to applaud, where the exits were, how the whole machine of live television actually worked. Among that crowd, seated near the end of a middle riser, was a man in a plain windbreaker. Nothing about him stood out. He'd gotten his ticket the same way most people in that room had, standing in line outside, showing identification, taking a numbered seat. Nobody working the door that night had any reason to look twice at him. He didn't look angry. He didn't look dangerous. He looked, if anything, a little too still, a little too focused on the empty stage in a way that a casual audience member usually isn't. He had a story he believed the world owed him, the kind of story that lives inside a person for months or years before it finally demands to be heard, and somewhere in the accumulating weight of that story, he had decided, quietly, privately, without telling anyone, that tonight, in this room, in front of these cameras, was where it would finally come out. The taping opened the way these things always opened, the bandleader counting off, a burst of theme music, the host walking out to applause, a monologue that landed reasonably well, a comedy sketch involving a mistaken hotel reservation that got the biggest laugh of the night. Then, after the second commercial break, the host turned toward the wings and said the words the audience had been waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee. The applause that met him was different in texture from the polite welcome given to the earlier guests, sharper, more excited. A few people in the risers actually standing without being cued to. Bruce walked out unhurried, shook the host's hand, gave a small nod to the audience, and sat. For the first several minutes, the conversation moved the way these conversations were supposed to move. The host asked about his childhood in Hong Kong, about learning Wing Chun as a teenager, about the frustrations of trying to break into an American film industry that, at the time, had very little idea what to do with him. Bruce answered thoughtfully, without rushing, occasionally letting a joke land dry and unannounced, which got its own laughs precisely because nobody expected humor from him. People assume martial arts is about hitting things, he said at one point. Really, it's about understanding things. The hitting is what's left over once you understand. The host, working from his prepared list, but genuinely curious now, leaned forward. Give me an example. What do you mean, understanding? If someone attacks you with anger, Bruce said, the anger is doing most of the work for them. It's making them predictable. It's using up their energy before the fight even starts. If you can stay calm while they can't, you've already won something, before either of you has thrown a single technique. Sounds like something you'd want to test, the host said, grinning, half joking. Want to prove it? Right here. Bruce smiled and shook his head. Television isn't the place for that. This chair is. The audience laughed. It was, by any measure, a good segment, warm, a little philosophical, occasionally funny. Exactly the kind of television the producers had hoped for when they finally convinced him to come on. 12 minutes in, nothing about the evening suggested it would become anything else. It happened during a pause, one of those small, unremarkable lulls, where the host glances down at his notes to find the next question, and the room, for half a second, goes quiet enough to hear the studio air conditioning cycle on. The man in the windbreaker stood up. At first, most of the room registered it as nothing more than someone stretching or heading for the restroom during the pause. But he didn't move toward the aisle. He stayed exactly where he was, standing among the seated rows, and started talking, loudly, then louder, words tumbling over each other in a way that made them hard to follow. Something about being overlooked. Something about deserving to be seen. Whatever grievance had been building in him for however long, it came out now in a rush that had clearly been rehearsed in his head many times, but had never once been spoken out loud until this exact moment. The floor manager, standing just off camera, with the headset clamped over one ear, reacted immediately, waving toward the two ushers stationed near the studio doors. Heads throughout the risers began turning. The murmur that had filled the room a moment earlier died into something tighter, more anxious. Then the knife came out. It was a folding blade, the kind that could sit unnoticed in a coat pocket, and he held it low, in front of him, in a grip that had nothing practiced about it. A frightened man's grip, unsteady, the blade wavering slightly with the shake in his hand. The gasp that moved through the audience was almost a physical thing, a wave you could watch travel backward through the risers as more and more people registered what they were looking at. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped as someone stood too fast. The band, which had no cue for anything like this, went silent instrument by instrument, the way a room does when everyone simultaneously understands they need to stop making noise. The host, mid-sentence, froze completely, note still in hand. Bruce didn't stand immediately. That's the detail that people who picture this scene tend to come back to, over and over, when they try to describe why it stayed with them. For a full second, maybe two, which is a very long time when a blade is involved, he simply sat and watched. Not the knife first. The man, the angle of his shoulders, where his weight had settled, whether his eyes were tracking the exits, tracking the ushers now moving down the aisle, or tracking Bruce himself. Only once he'd read all of that did he rise from the chair, slowly, both hands open and visible, nothing about his posture suggesting a threat of his own. He stepped down off the low-stage platform, and in doing so placed himself, deliberately, between the man and the nearest row of audience seats, where several people sat frozen mid-flinch, unsure whether running would make things better or worse. "Nobody needs to move," Bruce said. His voice didn't rise the way a performer's voice usually rises to fill a room. It stayed low, level, almost conversational, and somehow it carried anyway, all the way to the back riser. "Just stay where you are. Everyone's all right." The man swung the knife in a short, jerky arc, not really an attack, so much as a physical exclamation point, the equivalent of shouting "stay back" with his whole arm. Bruce didn't close the distance to meet it. He didn't need to yet. He simply mirrored the man's small, agitated movements with quiet, unhurried steps of his own, keeping exactly enough space between them that the blade, even at full extension, found nothing but air. "You wanted people to listen," Bruce said. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement, offered without judgment. "They're listening now. Everyone in this room is listening to you right now." The man's arm trembled slightly, the particular tremor that comes from adrenaline in someone unused to holding something capable of hurting another person. His eyes flicked toward the cameras, toward the frozen host, toward the audience holding its collective breath, and then back to Bruce. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly. The recognition, maybe for the first time since he'd stood up, that this wasn't unfolding the way he'd imagined it. During however many nights he'd rehearsed some version of this moment in his head. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was rushing him. He was being spoken to, evenly, like a person. "Put it down," Bruce said, still without raising his voice, still keeping the same careful distance. "You don't need it to be heard. You're already being heard." For a long moment, nothing happened. On a soundstage, under those flat white lights, with dozens of people holding still in unison, that pause stretched out far longer than its actual length in seconds. The man's arm didn't drop. Bruce's attention didn't waver. Then the man made the only real mistake of the whole encounter. He stepped forward himself, closing the distance he'd been maintaining, the knife rising slightly as he moved. This was the single moment in the entire scene where Bruce actually moved with speed. His left hand came up and across, not meeting the strike head-on, but catching the man's wrist from the outside, redirecting the arm sideways rather than trying to stop its force directly. The same underlying idea that ran through nearly everything he'd ever taught. Don't fight force with force. Guide it somewhere it can't do damage. His right hand followed immediately, closing over the back of the man's hand at precisely the joint where a knife grip is weakest, the place where a small, targeted rotation costs the holder all their leverage without requiring any real strength at all. The blade simply left his hand. It dropped, clattered once against the studio floor, and skidded a few feet before coming to rest near the edge of the stage platform, spinning once, and going still. The man's knees buckled slightly, not from pain, since almost none had been applied, but from the sudden, disorienting absence of the thing he'd been gripping so tightly it had become part of how his whole body was standing. Bruce didn't release the wrist. He guided the man down, didn't shove him, didn't force him, into a kneeling position on the studio floor, one hand still lightly controlling the arm, the other resting on his shoulder with something that, on camera, would later be described by more than one viewer as gentleness. "Stay there," Bruce said quietly. "It's over. Nobody's going to hurt you." Security reached them 4 or 5 seconds later, an eternity in television time, though barely enough time for the studio audience to fully process what they'd just watched happen 12 feet in front of them. 2 ushers took over, one on each side, helping the man to his feet without roughness. He wasn't resisting. Whatever had been driving him up out of his seat and into the aisle seemed to have gone out of him along with the knife. The audience didn't erupt into applause the way a crowd does for a well-landed joke or a magic trick. What moved through the risers instead was quieter, an audible collective exhale, people reaching instinctively for the hand of whoever was sitting beside them, a woman a few rows back beginning to cry, softly, with the particular relief of someone whose body had been braced for something much worse. The host, still on his feet near the low stage, finally found his voice. Is everyone all right? Bruce, are you?" "I'm fine," Bruce said, and he was. Not a mark on him, his breathing even, his hand steady. He crossed to where the knife had come to rest, picked it up carefully by the closed handle with 2 fingers, and carried it, unhurried, to the nearest security officer rather than handing it to anyone else in the room. The man was led out through a side door, not roughly, not triumphantly on anyone's part, just quietly, the way you'd walk someone who was shaking and exhausted toward somewhere he could sit down. Bruce watched him go for a moment, and there was nothing in his expression that read as anger. If anything, what showed on his face in that moment looked closer to concern. Off camera, the floor manager was half panicking into his headset, trying to decide in real time whether to cut to a commercial break, whether the segment could even continue, whether the network's legal department was going to have very strong opinions about all of this by the time anyone got home that night. Bruce didn't wait for that decision to be made for him. He climbed back onto the low stage, sat down in the same chair he'd occupied 12 minutes earlier, folded his hands, and looked toward the host. "We can keep going," he said, "or we can stop here. Either is fine with me, but I don't think anyone in this room needs to be more frightened tonight than they already have been." To his credit, the host didn't rush back into his prepared questions. He sat down slowly, visibly shaken, hands not quite steady, and asked the only thing that seemed worth asking in that moment. How did you stay that calm? Bruce considered the question the way he considered most questions put to him, not performing an answer for the cameras, but actually thinking it through in real time. Fear is useful, he said finally. It tells you something is wrong. That's its whole job. But if you let it decide what your body does next, you've already given away the one advantage you had, which is that you could still think clearly. And in that moment, he couldn't. He wasn't dangerous because he was strong. He was dangerous because he was frightened and holding something sharp. Those two things together are what you have to respect, not the blade by itself. You didn't hurt him, the host said. It wasn't quite a question. There was no reason to, Bruce answered. The goal was never to win against him. The goal was for the knife to be somewhere else, and for nobody in this room to get hurt while that happened. Once the knife was gone, everything left, his fear, his anger, whatever brought him to stand up tonight. That isn't something you solve by hurting a person further. That's something for people whose actual job is to help him, afterward, somewhere. Quieter than this. The studio audience, still settling back into their seats, listened to this with a different quality of attention than they'd given the earlier, lighter part of the interview. The particular attention people give when they've just watched something proven true in front of them instead of merely described. Someone in the front row, emboldened by the strange intimacy the moment had created, called out to ask whether he'd been afraid himself. Of course, Bruce said, and the plainness of the admission seemed to land harder in the room than any denial could have. Training doesn't remove fear. I want to be clear about that, because people often think it does. What training does is make sure fear doesn't get to make the decisions anymore. That's the entire difference. The fear is still there. It just isn't driving. The host, recovering some of his composure, asked one more question, quieter than the rest. What do you think happens to him now? The man. Bruce was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. I hope somebody actually listens to whatever it was he was trying to say. Underneath all of that. Not because it excuses tonight. It doesn't. But most people don't stand up in a room full of strangers holding something dangerous unless something has already gone badly wrong for them, long before they ever walk through those doors. In this imagined version of events, the segment aired anyway, trimmed by network lawyers to remove the sharpest few seconds, but leaving the core of the exchange intact. Bruce's stillness, the quiet exchange of words, the moment the blade left the man's hand. Viewers who watched it that night, and the many who saw it later in replays and clipped shows, tended to remember it in a way that surprised them. Not the knife itself, not even the technique that disarmed it, which happened too fast and too cleanly for most people to fully register on a first viewing. What people remembered, oddly, was the silence before Bruce said his first word, that one long second where he simply watched, before he moved at all. And they remembered that once it was over, the first thing he did wasn't check on himself. It was make sure the people nearest him were all right. None of this happened, of course. There was no man in a windbreaker, no interrupted interview, no folding blade skidding across a painted soundstage floor. It's a story built from a familiar wish, that faced with real danger, calm can be trained the way anything else is trained, and that the most impressive thing a person can do in a frightening moment isn't the technique itself, but the stillness that makes the technique unnecessary until the precise instant it's actually needed.